In the opulent courts and shadowy alleys of Renaissance Europe, where wealth glittered and power ruled, one woman's name became a whispered legend: Isabella de Vera. Known as the Bride of Death, she married 10 men, nobles, merchants, and scholars, and left each one dead. Their fortunes mysteriously vanished. History paints her as a monster, a seductress who wove a web of deceit and poison. But behind the scandalous tales lies a darker truth, one that challenges our understanding of survival in a world that trapped women in gilded cages. The first husband, Count Alessandro di Marco, died 3 months after their wedding feast, a grand affair that bankrupted his estate to showcase his new bride's beauty. The physicians declared it a fever, though servants whispered of his screams in the night, clawing at his throat as if invisible hands choked him. His gold disappeared with Isabella, who emerged from mourning draped in black silk that cost more than most earned in a lifetime. By the time merchant François Dubois became husband number 4, the pattern had crystallized. Wealthy men would court the beautiful widow, drawn by her luminous pale eyes and the fortune that seemed to follow her like morning mist. They ignored the warnings, dismissed the rumors as jealous gossip from lesser women. Each believed he would be different, that his love would tame whatever darkness lived within her graceful form. Yet Isabella's true genius lay not in poison or daggers, but in understanding the very system that sought to destroy her. In a world where women inherited nothing, could own nothing, and existed only as vessels for male ambition, she had discovered the one loophole that allowed her to accumulate power: widowhood. Each marriage was a carefully orchestrated performance, each death a masterpiece of timing and misdirection. The church records, yellowed with age and smudged by countless fingers seeking scandal, tell only half the story. They chronicle the marriages, the deaths, the mysterious disappearances of fortunes. But they cannot capture the nights Isabella spent studying her husband's business ledgers by candlelight, memorizing trade routes and debt structures. They cannot record her conversations with the poisoners and loan sharks who inhabited the city's underbelly, or her careful cultivation of servants whose loyalty could be bought with the promise of freedom from their own forms of bondage. Isabella's story is not just about murder. It's about a woman navigating a society that valued her only as property, where marriage was a transaction and freedom a dangerous dream. In her calculated steps through ballrooms and bedchambers, she danced on the edge of a precipice that claimed countless other women who dared to want more than their prescribed fate. If you're captivated by hidden histories and the untold stories of those who defied their fates, consider liking and subscribing for more tales like this. Comment below to share where you're reading from. Let's connect across time and space to uncover the truths history tried to bury. In Renaissance Europe, women were pawns in a game of power. Marriages were arranged to secure alliances, wealth, or status, with little regard for love or consent. For a woman like Isabella, born into a modest family in a bustling Italian city-state, beauty was both a blessing and a curse. It drew the attention of powerful men, but offered no protection from their control. Women of her time had few paths: marry well, enter a convent, or face ruin. Isabella chose marriage 10 times over, but each union ended in death, her husbands found pale and lifeless, with no trace of violence. The city of Vera, where Isabella drew her first breath in 1502, existed as a microcosm of Renaissance contradictions. Magnificent palazzos cast shadows over cramped quarters where artisans and merchants struggled to maintain their precarious positions in society's rigid hierarchy. Here, among the marble facades and hidden courtyards, young girls learned early that their bodies were currency, their marriages business investments, their happiness irrelevant to the calculations of fathers and brothers who viewed them as assets to be leveraged. Isabella's father, Marco de Vera, owned a small but profitable fabric workshop that supplied the city's growing merchant class. Her mother, Katerina, had once possessed beauty that rivaled Isabella's own, a beauty that had secured her marriage to Marco despite her lack of dowry, but which faded quickly under the weight of bearing 7 children and managing household accounts. By the time Isabella reached her 15th year, 3 of her siblings had died of plague, 2 brothers had been sent to apprenticeships they could barely afford, and her sister Elena had entered the convent of Santa Lucia, not from religious calling, but because the family could not afford another marriage portion. The mathematics of survival in Renaissance Italy were brutally simple. A respectable marriage required a dowry equivalent to 3 years of a skilled craftsman's wages. Without it, a woman faced prostitution, servitude, or starvation. Marco de Vera calculated these numbers nightly by candlelight, his ledgers stained with wine and worry. Isabella represented both his greatest hope and his most dangerous liability. Her beauty could attract a wealthy suitor, but beauty alone, without substantial dowry, might only secure her a position as a mistress rather than a wife. Isabella's first marriage, at 16, was to a wealthy merchant twice her age. The contract was signed before she met him, her dowry exchanged for his promise of security. Giacomo Torelli dealt in precious spices from the East, his warehouses heavy with the scent of cinnamon and black pepper that commanded prices higher than silver. His previous wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior, leaving him with twin sons who regarded Isabella with the suspicious hostility reserved for usurpers. But security came at a cost: obedience, silence, and submission. The marriage contract, preserved in the city archives, reveals the suffocating precision with which her life was circumscribed. She could not leave the house without permission. She could not speak to merchants or tradesmen directly. Her clothing, her companions, even her reading materials required Giacomo's approval. The document specified that any inheritance would pass to his sons, leaving Isabella with nothing should he predecease her, unless, the contract carefully noted, she remained chaste and under the guardianship of his male relatives. Within these constraints, however, Isabella began her education in survival. Giacomo's household included his elderly mother, Donna Margherita, who had lived through 4 plagues, 3 wars, and 2 failed harvests. From this shrewd woman, Isabella learned that knowledge was the only possession that could never be confiscated. She memorized the names of Giacomo's business associates, their debts and credits, their family alliances and bitter feuds. She learned to read the subtle signs of illness, the yellowish tinge that preceded liver failure, the swelling that announced heart disease, the tremor that suggested poisoning by mercury or lead. Most crucially, she learned about the plants that grew in Donna Margherita's carefully tended garden. Foxglove for heart ailments, in precise doses. Belladonna for pain, though too much would cause delirium and death. Yew berries, beautiful and deadly. Oleander, whose flowers could stop a heart as effectively as any blade. The old woman presented these lessons as healing knowledge, the traditional domain of women who served as healers in communities too poor for physicians. But Isabella understood the darker implications. Healing and harming often differed only in dosage and intent. Historical records suggest her husbands were chosen by her family or creditors, each marriage a step to settle debts or climb the social ladder. After Giacomo's mysterious death, officially recorded as heart failure, though he had been healthy days before, Isabella inherited nothing according to the marriage contract. However, she had carefully observed where he hid his most valuable assets, information that proved negotiable with certain disreputable characters who frequented the Port District. More importantly, she had learned to forge his handwriting with precision that fooled even his closest associates. The transformation from victim to predator occurred gradually, each marriage teaching Isabella new skills in manipulation, finance, and the delicate art of appearing helpless while wielding considerable power. Her second husband, a minor nobleman named Count Aldrich, lasted 8 months before succumbing to what appeared to be consumption. Her third, the scholar Maestro Francesco, died of what his colleagues believed to be exhaustion from his studies, though Isabella had carefully poisoned his wine with doses so small that the symptoms mimicked natural decline. Yet, as each man died, rumors swirled. Poison, witchcraft, or accursed beauty. The whispers followed Isabella through the narrow streets of Vera, creating an atmosphere of fear that paradoxically increased her allure to certain men. Some were drawn by the danger she represented, others by the challenge of being the one to survive her embrace. A few, particularly among the older merchants and nobles, were attracted by the very rumors that terrified others. They saw in Isabella a woman who had mastered the game they all played, who had found a way to accumulate power in a system designed to deny her agency. The pattern that emerged reveals not random violence, but calculated strategy. Each husband provided Isabella with new resources, knowledge, connections, and most importantly, legitimacy. As a widow, she could own property, conduct business, and move through society with freedoms denied to wives and unmarried women. Each death was carefully staged to appear natural, each inheritance legally obtained through forged documents or coerced wills. She developed a network of accomplices among servants, apothecaries, and minor criminals who benefited from her success and feared her displeasure. What drove Isabella to such extremes? To understand, we must look beyond the gossip to the suffocating constraints of her world, where a woman's worth was tied to her husband's name, and defiance could mean death. In a society that offered women only 3 choices, marriage, convent, or ruin, Isabella created a 4th option through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an intimate understanding of the very system that sought to destroy her. Her crimes were not acts of passion but calculated responses to systematic oppression, each murder a small revolution against a world that viewed her as property rather than person. Isabella's life as a wife was a performance, each marriage a stage where she played the role of the perfect bride. Her husbands expected a demure companion, a trophy to display at banquets, a vessel for their heirs. But behind closed doors, many were cruel, demanding absolute control, punishing perceived slights, or squandering her dowry on gambling and mistresses. Isabella learned quickly that survival meant mastering deception. She studied her husband's habits, their weaknesses, their secrets. Whispers from apothecaries hint at her knowledge of herbs, belladonna, arsenic, plants that could kill without a trace. The performance began each morning before dawn, when Isabella would arrange her features into expressions of contentment and devotion. Her mirror, a costly piece of Venetian glass that husband number 4 had purchased to admire her beauty, reflected back a face that had learned to betray nothing of the calculations occurring behind luminous eyes. She practiced smiles, the shy downward glance for public gatherings, the adoring upward gaze for intimate dinners, the empty, pleasant expression for those moments when her husband's cruelty required her to disappear entirely while remaining physically present. Count Aldrich, her second husband, had been her first conscious experiment in the delicate art of elimination. Where Giacomo's death had been almost accidental, a fortunate confluence of her herbal knowledge and his weak heart, Aldrich's demise was carefully orchestrated over months of patient preparation. He was a man of rigid habits who rose at the same hour each morning, took his meals at precisely timed intervals, and retired each evening with a cup of wine spiced with cinnamon and honey to aid his digestion. Aldrich's cruelty took the form of isolation. Within a week of their marriage, he had dismissed all the female servants from his household, replacing them with men who reported her every movement, every conversation, every glance toward a window. He forbade her from visiting the market, attending church services, or maintaining correspondence with her family. The villa became her prison, Its beautiful frescoed walls transformed into barriers that separated her from any life beyond his control. But isolation worked both ways. With no other women in the household to observe her movements, Isabella found herself free to explore areas typically forbidden to wives. She discovered Aldrich's private study, where he kept detailed records of his various business dealings, many of them illegal smuggling operations that avoided the city-state's heavy tariffs. She learned the locations of his hidden safes, memorized the names of his criminal associates, and most importantly, found his collection of rare books on natural philosophy, including several texts on the medicinal and toxic properties of common plants. The transformation of Aldrich from captor to victim required 7 months of careful preparation. Isabella began by cultivating his trust through perfect submission. She never questioned his decisions, never showed displeasure at his restrictions, never gave him reason to doubt her complete devotion. This performance was so convincing that he eventually relaxed his surveillance, allowing her brief periods alone in the villa's extensive gardens where she could gather the materials for her true work. Foxglove grew wild along the garden's eastern wall, its purple flowers beautiful enough that she could claim to be gathering decorative blooms while actually harvesting the leaves that contained digitalis, a substance that, in tiny doses administered over time, could weaken a heart until it simply stopped beating. She dried the leaves carefully, ground them to powder using a pestle concealed beneath loose floorboards in her chamber, and began the delicate process of introducing measured amounts into Aldrich's evening wine. Each marriage brought new challenges that required increasingly sophisticated solutions. Maestro Francesco, the scholar who became husband number 3, presented entirely different obstacles. Unlike Aldrich's physical cruelty, Francesco's abuse was intellectual and emotional. He delighted in demonstrating her supposed ignorance, questioning her in front of dinner guests about subjects he knew she had never been taught, then ridiculing her responses as evidence of women's natural inferiority. Francesco's household buzzed with activity, students, colleagues, and servants constantly coming and going, making isolation impossible but privacy equally elusive. His death required a more public approach, one that would appear natural to the many witnesses who observed their daily life. Isabella chose mercury poisoning, administered through the ink he used for his scholarly correspondence. Mercury was readily available in apothecaries as a treatment for syphilis, and its symptoms, tremor, confusion, eventual madness, and death, could easily be attributed to the rigors of scholarly life. The process took nearly a year, during which Isabella played the devoted wife, nursing her increasingly erratic husband through what appeared to be a gradual mental decline. She attended physicians' consultations, wept convincingly at his bedside, and garnered considerable sympathy from the scholarly community for her faithful devotion to a man whose brilliant mind was clearly being destroyed by his excessive dedication to learning. One husband locked her in their villa, fearing her beauty would attract rivals. This was Signore Benedetto Grimaldi, husband number 5, whose jealousy manifested as paranoid surveillance that made Aldrich's restrictions seem benevolent by comparison. Grimaldi hired spies to watch her even within their home, installed locks on every door, and required her to account for every moment of every day. His fear of losing her to another man consumed him so completely that he became his own worst enemy, creating the very isolation that allowed Isabella to work unobserved during the brief moments when his attention was occupied elsewhere. Another forced her to host lavish feasts while he flaunted his affairs. Lorenzo Capelli, husband number 7, used Isabella's beauty and grace as tools to enhance his own reputation while simultaneously humiliating her through public displays of infidelity. She was required to smile graciously at his mistresses, to serve wine to men who whispered crude speculations about her marital satisfaction, to maintain perfect composure while Lorenzo made crude jokes about women's proper place in society. These dinner parties became Isabella's hunting ground, With dozens of guests, multiple courses, and wine flowing freely, she could introduce carefully prepared substances into specific goblets while appearing to be nothing more than an attentive hostess. Lorenzo's death appeared to be a heart attack brought on by excessive eating and drinking, witnessed by 30 guests who could testify to his apparent good health moments before his collapse. The psychological toll was immense. Living in constant fear, forced to smile through humiliation, knowing a single misstep could lead to accusations of infidelity or worse. Each night, Isabella would lie beside men who had the legal right to beat, imprison, or even kill her, while planning their deaths with the same careful attention they had once devoted to controlling her life. The weight of sustained deception began to manifest in physical symptoms. Persistent headaches that no amount of willow bark could relieve, a tremor in her hands that appeared only when she believed herself unobserved, and dreams filled with the faces of the dead who visited her with expressions of reproach and sorrow. Yet Isabella adapted, her charm a weapon, her silence a shield. She developed an almost supernatural ability to read people's desires and reflect them back in her own behavior. With scholarly men, she displayed just enough intelligence to flatter their egos without threatening their superiority. With merchants, she demonstrated practical understanding of household management and financial matters. With nobles, she embodied the refined grace that validated their claims to elevated status. She navigated courtly intrigue with increasing skill, deflecting suspicion with grace that masked calculation. When whispers began to circulate about the unusual frequency with which her husbands died, Isabella responded not with defensive denials, but with performances of grief so convincing that observers felt guilty for harboring suspicious thoughts. She wore mourning clothes longer than custom required, established charitable foundations in her dead husband's names, and spoke of each man with such apparent devotion that questioning her sincerity seemed not only cruel but impious. Her reputation as a devoted wife actually strengthened with each death, creating a protective mythology that made accusations seem not merely unfounded but morally reprehensible. Who would suspect a woman who wept so beautifully, who honored her dead husband's memories so faithfully, who seemed to suffer so visibly from her repeated losses? But the cost of her actions grew heavier with each performance. Each death left her more isolated, her reputation darkening among those who possessed the intelligence to recognize patterns that others missed, her soul burdened by the lives she took to reclaim her own. The weight of sustained deception began to change her in fundamental ways, creating a distance between her performed self and whatever authentic identity might have existed beneath the layers of careful construction. By the time husband number 8 entered her life, Isabella had become something unprecedented in Renaissance society, a woman who wielded genuine power through methods so subtle that their existence remained largely invisible to those around her. Yet this power came at a price that grew steeper with each success. The gradual erosion of any self that existed independent of the elaborate performance that had become her survival mechanism. She had mastered the art of being everything others needed her to be, but in the process had perhaps lost the ability to discover who she might have been if given the freedom to exist without deception. Isabella's 10th marriage marked the peak of her infamy. Her final husband, a powerful duke, was found dead mere months after their wedding, his coffers emptied, his household in chaos. The courts could no longer ignore the pattern. Isabella was arrested, her trial a spectacle that drew crowds eager to see the Black Widow condemned. But her testimony revealed a truth that shook the judges. Each marriage was a prison, each death a desperate bid for freedom. She spoke of beatings, betrayals, and the suffocating weight of a society that saw her as property, not a person. Duke Ferdinando Monteverdi had been different from her previous husbands in ways that ultimately made him more dangerous than all the others combined. Where her earlier victims had been driven by simple cruelties, jealousy, greed, or casual misogyny. Ferdinando possessed the intelligence to recognize Isabella's true nature and the power to destroy her completely. He had courted her not despite her reputation, but because of it, drawn by the challenge of taming what others had failed to control. Their courtship had been a chess match played across the glittering ballrooms of 3 different city-states. Ferdinando's wealth allowed him to hire investigators who traced Isabella's movements through her previous marriages, documenting inconsistencies in the official records of her husband's deaths. He presented himself as a man who understood her true nature and promised to provide the protection and partnership she had never found in previous unions. For the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to hope that she might find not just another victim, but an ally who could offer her genuine security without requiring her destruction. The deception was masterful and complete. Within weeks of their wedding, Ferdinando revealed his true intentions. He had married Isabella not to possess her, but to possess her power. He understood that her reputation as the bride of death could be weaponized for his own purposes, turning her into an instrument for eliminating his political enemies and business rivals. The marriage contract he had convinced her to sign granted him control not only over her inherited wealth, but over her person in ways that exceeded even Renaissance legal standards. Ferdinando's cruelty was systematic and calculated. He confined Isabella to the fortress-like palazzo outside Milan, surrounded by guards who answered only to him. But unlike previous husbands who had sought to control her through isolation, Ferdinando forced Isabella to participate actively in his schemes. He would invite his enemies to elaborate dinner parties where Isabella was required to deploy her skills as hostess and poisoner simultaneously, eliminating his rivals while maintaining the facade of gracious hospitality. The psychological torture was exquisite in its precision. Ferdinando understood that Isabella's previous murders had been acts of rebellion, however twisted, that provided her with some sense of agency and control. By forcing her to kill for his purposes rather than her own, he stripped away even this dark source of empowerment, reducing her to nothing more than a beautiful and deadly instrument of his ambition. For 8 months, Isabella endured this existence, watching helplessly as Ferdinando consolidated power through her forced participation in a series of carefully orchestrated deaths. Each murder she committed under his direction felt like a corruption of the rebellion that had once defined her survival. She was no longer killing to escape oppression, but to serve it in its most refined and terrible form. The breaking point came when Ferdinando announced his intention to use Isabella's reputation to eliminate his own nephew, a young man whose only crime was inheriting a claim to lands Ferdinando coveted. The planned victim was barely 20, newly married, with a pregnant wife who reminded Isabella painfully of her own younger self. For the first time since Giacomo's death, Isabella found herself unable to complete the task Ferdinando had assigned. Her refusal unleashed the full force of his calculated cruelty. The physical beatings were severe but carefully controlled, never marking her face or hands in ways that would be visible to servants or guests. More devastating was his systematic destruction of every relationship that had provided Isabella with even marginal support. He dismissed servants who had shown her kindness, cut off all communication with her surviving family members, and spread carefully crafted rumors that isolated her from the few women in noble society who had maintained cordial relations despite her reputation. Isabella's final act of rebellion required her to abandon the subtle methods that had served her for nearly 15 years. On the night of February 14, 1523, during a feast celebrating Ferdinando's latest political victory, she poisoned not only the Duke's wine but her own, choosing mutual destruction over continued subjugation. The poison she selected, extract of yew berries mixed with a tincture she had prepared from death-cap mushrooms, worked slowly enough to allow both victims several hours of consciousness during which the horrible realization of their mutual fate gradually became apparent. But where Isabella had intended to die alongside her tormentor, Ferdinando's constitution proved remarkably resilient. He survived long enough to summon physicians and guards, to accuse Isabella of attempted murder, and to ensure that she would face justice for this final, desperate act of defiance. His death, when it finally came 3 days later, appeared to observers as the natural consequence of food poisoning rather than deliberate murder, leaving Isabella to face charges based on his deathbed accusations rather than clear evidence of poisoning. Her words exposed a brutal irony. While men of her time prided themselves on honor and chivalry, they built a system that crushed women's autonomy. Isabella's murders were not born of greed but of survival, a rebellion against a world that offered her no other escape. The trial that followed became the spectacle Ferdinando had always intended, drawing crowds from across northern Italy who came to witness the condemnation of the notorious Bride of Death. The proceedings revealed the magnificent hypocrisy at the heart of Renaissance society. The same judges who condemned Isabella for murdering her husbands had themselves arranged marriages for their daughters with men known to be violent, corrupt, or mentally unstable. The prosecutors who painted her as an unnatural monster routinely ignored complaints from women who suffered beatings, imprisonment, or worse at the hands of legally authorized husbands. The crowds who cheered for her execution included men who had committed similar murders with perfect impunity simply because their victims had been wives rather than husbands. Isabella's testimony, delivered over 3 days of questioning, methodically dismantled every assumption underlying the charges against her. She provided detailed accounts of each husband's cruelties, documented the legal and financial constraints that had made escape impossible through conventional means, and demonstrated the comprehensive nature of the system that had trapped her from childhood. Her words carried the terrible authority of lived experience, spoken by a woman who had nothing left to lose and no reason to maintain the protective lies that had once shielded her from complete social annihilation. Yet her defiance came at a terrible cost. She stood alone, branded a monster, her humanity erased by the same society that drove her to kill. The trial transcripts reveal a woman who had been transformed by years of deception and violence into something unprecedented in her world, a female voice speaking truth about systematic oppression with complete disregard for the consequences. The judges, attorneys, and spectators who witnessed her testimony found themselves confronted with accusations that implicated not just individual men, but the entire structure of their civilization. In her final act of resistance, she refused to beg for mercy, choosing death over submission. When offered the opportunity to confess her crimes and throw herself upon the court's mercy, Isabella instead delivered a final statement that lasted nearly 2 hours and left the courtroom in stunned silence. She accepted full responsibility for the death she had caused, but refused to accept the characterization of herself as uniquely evil or unnatural. Instead, she positioned her crimes as the inevitable consequence of a system that offered women no alternatives to subjugation or destruction. Her execution on March 15, 1523, drew the largest crowd in Milan's history. Contemporary accounts describe a woman who walked to the scaffold with perfect composure, dressed in black silk that emphasized her still remarkable beauty. She declined the services of a priest, refused the blindfold traditionally offered to condemned prisoners, and spoke her final words directly to the assembled crowd. "I die not as a monster, but as a woman who chose freedom over slavery, even when that freedom could only be purchased with blood." Her story forces us to ask, was she a villain or a victim pushed to the edge? The question itself reveals the inadequacy of simple moral categories when applied to lives shaped by systematic oppression. Isabella de Vera died as she had lived her final years, as a woman who refused to accept the choices her society had provided, even when creating alternatives required her to become something terrible and unprecedented. Her legacy remains not in the deaths she caused, but in the questions her life raises about the price of rebellion and the cost of survival in a world that offers certain people no good options. Isabella's story rippled beyond her own life, exposing the rot beneath Renaissance society's glittering facade. The normalization of arranged marriages, where women were traded like goods, created the conditions for her rebellion. Court records and letters from the period reveal how society turned a blind eye to spousal abuse, valuing family honor over individual suffering. Isabella's actions challenged this silence, forcing whispers of reform among progressive thinkers, though change was slow to come. The immediate aftermath of Isabella's execution revealed the profound unease her story had created within the established order. Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, later Pope Paul III, wrote privately to his nephew that Isabella's trial had exposed wounds in the body of Christian society that we have long pretended did not fester. His correspondence, discovered in Vatican archives centuries later, reveals how Isabella's testimony had forced even conservative church leaders to confront the contradiction between Christian teachings about human dignity and the legal structures that reduced women to property. The merchant Francesco Dettini, whose extensive business correspondence survives in Prado's archives, noted a marked reluctance among potential buyers to complete marriage negotiations in the months following Isabella's trial. "The mothers weep openly now when contracts are discussed," he wrote to his business partner in Florence. And even the fathers seem less eager to conclude arrangements they once pursued with enthusiasm. The brief disruption to the marriage market demonstrated how Isabella's story had penetrated public consciousness in ways that challenged fundamental economic relationships. Her story also highlights the complicity of those around her: families who sold daughters to settle debts, apothecaries who supplied poisons, servants who looked the other way. The apothecary Maestro Giuliano, who had provided Isabella with various herbs and compounds throughout her marriages, was arrested 3 days after her execution. Under interrogation, he revealed that Isabella had been only one of several noble women who regularly purchased substances that could serve dual purposes as medicines or poisons. His customer records, preserved in Milan's municipal archives, list at least 16 other women of elevated social status who had made similar purchases during the same period. The economic and social systems that profited from women's subjugation fueled a cycle of exploitation, much like the slave markets of ancient Rome. Notaries who specialized in marriage contracts commanded fees equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual wages, creating powerful financial incentives to facilitate unions regardless of their human cost. Banking houses that provided dowries as investments expected returns that could only be realized through women's complete submission to their husband's financial authority. Even the church collected substantial fees for marriage ceremonies and dispensations, making institutional reform economically costly as well as theologically challenging. Archaeological finds, such as poison vials and coded letters, hint at other women who may have followed Isabella's path, their stories lost to history. Excavations at the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie in Bologna uncovered a cache of small glass vials hidden beneath floorboards in what had once been the quarters reserved for noble women seeking sanctuary from abusive marriages. Chemical analysis of residue in these containers revealed traces of mercury, arsenic, and concentrated digitalis, the same substances Isabella had used in her crimes. More intriguingly, renovation work at the Palazzo Medici in Florence revealed a collection of letters hidden within a wall cavity, written in a cipher that took scholars decades to decode. These letters, exchanged between women across multiple Italian city-states, discussed methods for managing difficult marriages, using language that clearly referenced poison, staged accidents, and coordinated alibis. The correspondence suggests the existence of an informal network of women who shared knowledge and resources for eliminating abusive husbands, operating with enough sophistication to avoid detection for generations. The coded correspondence reveals that Isabella's story had become a template for other desperate women. References to following the Vera method and achieving the Milanese solution appear in letters dated as late as 1580, nearly 60 years after Isabella's execution. These women had learned from her mistakes, developing more subtle approaches that avoided the pattern of serial marriages that had ultimately exposed Isabella to judicial scrutiny. Her legacy reveals how a society that dehumanizes its most vulnerable invites rebellion, even if it comes at a devastating cost. The ripple effects of Isabella's story extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in her crimes or trial. Her testimony had articulated grievances that countless women had experienced but never been permitted to voice publicly, creating a vocabulary for discussing systematic oppression that had previously existed only in whispered conversations between trusted allies. The changes that eventually emerged, gradual reforms in marriage law, increased church oversight of spousal abuse, the establishment of convents specifically designed to shelter women fleeing violent husbands, came too late to save Isabella or her victims. But they represented acknowledgement that her crimes had exposed genuine social pathologies that required institutional responses beyond simple punishment of individual transgressors. Isabella de Vera died as a monster in the eyes of her contemporaries, but her story survived as something more complex, a case study in how systematic oppression creates the conditions for systematic resistance, even when that resistance takes forms that horrify the very people it might otherwise inspire to demand justice through less violent means. Isabella de Vera's life ended on the gallows, but her story lives as a warning and a challenge. She was not a hero, nor a simple villain, but a woman shaped by a world that denied her agency. Her marriages and murders force us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and morality. In remembering her, we honor the countless women whose voices were silenced, whose suffering was ignored to uphold a facade of civility. Today, as we navigate our own complex world, Isabella's story reminds us to examine the systems that limit freedom and enable exploitation. It urges us to listen to the marginalized, to question the narratives that glorify the powerful while erasing the vulnerable. By bringing her story to light, we commit to a future where no one must kill to be free. Share your thoughts below. What does Isabella's story teach us about our own time? Let's keep these forgotten voices alive, ensuring their sacrifices were not in vain.